Hi everybody, Mr. Vanderzee here. Today we're going to be talking about life on the home front during World War II here in the US. But we're actually going to start in Great Britain, because Great Britain had a very different home front than the US. Great Britain was more of an actual war front. Here you can see the destruction of these buildings. London especially was bombed like crazy all throughout the war, and especially during the Blitz by the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force in 1940 to 41. Lots and lots of destruction, and many civilians died in these bombings. Now, it's important to note that Britain also bombed much of Germany, and many German civilians died too. But here we have some pamphlets that show mothers, send them out of London, give them a chance of greater safety and health. And so many children were evacuated out of Great Britain. Many children were, out of London. And children were also prepared. You can see this child on the bottom right being fitted for a gas mask. A lot of resources were needed to evacuate women and children from the cities, especially the children. And actually that's the backdrop for the novel The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. The Pevensies, these kids, are being sent out to the country to live with a relative because it's just not safe in London during the war. Here in the U.S., we fight in a different way. Here you have on the left soldiers without guns. These are women in the workforce. Food is a weapon, don't waste it. Buy wisely, cook carefully, eat it all. How is food a weapon? We'll talk about that. Big guns of the home front. Action stations, everyone. We've got the double smoking barrels of this factory here. So rationing. Rationing was necessary during World War II because the government had to ensure that the war effort had resources and that supply and demand was controlled. So things that were rationed: food, clothing, shoes, gasoline and oil, tires. This woman, of course I can. I'm as patriotic as can be, and ration points won't worry me. So yep, she's canning rather than going out and buying canned food. She's probably growing her own food, and and then she cans it. And that is a good way to conserve, because you can grow your own food. Here on the upper right we have victory gardens. Victory gardens were planted all across the U.S. They were seen as a patriotic thing to do. Grow your own food so that you can take some strain off of the food supply, and there's more food for our soldiers who need it so badly. And then you've got these other posters: defense needs rubber, and then wanted for victory. Waste paper, old rags, scrap metal, old rubber, get in the scrap. War bonds were another thing that was a big factor here. The government needs an influx of money to finance the war. So not only do we want you to conserve resources, but we want you to buy bonds. One example, a $25 war bond bought for $18.75, and then you would get to cash that in a number of years, 10 years to be exact, to redeem that for the full $25. It's not much, but it's a little something, and it's a way to help out your government. The government uses this money to pay for tanks, ammunition, food, medicine, etc., and then they pay you back. Some individuals bought many bonds. It was seen as a very patriotic thing to do. This is an interesting one here in the upper left. I gave a man. Will you give at least 10% of your pay in war bonds? So what does that mean, she gave a man? Well, maybe her husband died in the war, and she's saying, I sacrificed. How can you sacrifice? I'm making bombs and buying bonds. Buy victory bonds, victory gardens, victory everything, because it's all for victory in the war is the idea. Save to beat the devil. Buy victory bonds. The devil, of course, well, there's Adolf Hitler with devil horns. Even the comic books of the time were used as sort of propaganda for the war effort. Sink the Japanese with bonds and stamps. So Superman, Batman, and Robin here are encouraging everyone to buy their bonds. The role of women during the war. It's important to recognize that women played many different roles, and in general were taking on a greater outside the family sort of role during the war. So women took on jobs at home left open by departed soldiers. That's how many of them were able to move into the workforce. 350,000 women served in uniform at home or abroad. women made it possible for industry to expand to meet war needs. Now, some women did go over to Europe and work as radio operators and nurses and things like that, but many women stayed here and helped with the war effort here in the U.S. So, here you have some posters showing women at work. Join us in a victory job. Apply at your nearest National Service office. Here's Dwight D. Eisenhower saying, "The contribution of women in America, whether on the farm or in the factory or in the uniform, to D-Day was a sine qua non of the invasion effort." What does that mean? Well, it means it was an essential piece, something they could not have done without for the D-Day invasion effort. So that's from General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who would later become a U.S. president. Another part of the Homefront effort was the Braceros program, which was a program that fulfilled a need for labor. In addition to women in the workforce, a lot of Hispanic Americans, specifically Mexicans in this case, were brought to the U.S. For temporary agricultural work. So this was an agreement, an official agreement, or a series of agreements between the U.S. and Mexican governments by which many Mexicans could come here and work legally. And it was renewed again in the 50s and again in the 60s before it was disbanded, because there was honestly just a need for labor, and it guaranteed certain rights for Mexicans, and was generally a good thing for many of these people coming over, who later were able to stay here in the U.S. And obviously was also a necessary and very important thing that helped the U.S. during the war effort. Now, this is all good, and this is all kind of feel-good stuff. People are getting rah-rah and getting into the war, and it's good. We're all joining together and working together. But there's also a dark side to the U.S. home front, and I think we see that most clearly in the Japanese internment. This is not something so nice to talk about, but it's an important thing for us to look back on and say, what can we learn from this? How can we do better? So what was the Japanese internment? Well, it was forced relocation of Japanese Americans on the West Coast to camps in the interior of the country. The idea was to remove any potential acts of treason where Japanese invasion could occur. Japanese, especially in California, were on the coast, were seen as potential spies. Japanese could potentially supervise and survey the movement of naval vessels and all this, and could potentially report this to Japan. That was the idea anyway. So 110,000 Japanese were relocated. Over 60% of them were American citizens. And that's what's interesting here. This is a forced relocation and basically detention in some ways. It's almost like taking American citizens and putting them in prison. Anyway, I'm getting ranty. I'll let you be the judge after we watch a couple of video clips here. There are 3 clips that I'm going to link to in the description of this video. You'll find a link, or on Google Classroom, I'll put a link to document 2 that has the 3 videos. You only have to watch parts, so pay attention to the timestamps that you need to.